Hello and welcome to June's Bookorama. I'm June Thomas. I was back at my childhood home last week. I haven't lived there for more than 40 years, so I don't have a lot of stuff in that house, but every time I go there, I notice a jar of buttons. I'm from a generation that expressed its political opinions via buttons, or badges as we call them in the UK. My coats were all like Swiss cheese from the addition and removal of buttons at moments of change. Like when a bill was introduced into Parliament and suddenly there was a new cause that I needed to indicate my position on. Most of these buttons are very old now, so let's take a walk down memory lane. A lot of the buttons I'm going to show you are political in one way or another, but I also have to demonstrate that I was the kind of dweeb who collected badges from the comics I read and the TV shows I watched. Here are several from Beano and Dandy. Now I understand why I ended up living in Scotland. And one from the Beezer. If you were really dedicated to dweebery, you could even find a badge for young readers of the TV Times. Our house was an ITV home. We almost never watched the BBC, which my parents thought was way too posh for us, which meant that my kids' show of choice was Magpie. Magpie had a long-running programme of issuing badges based on the one for sorrow, two for joy, three for a girl, and four for a boy, etc. rhyme. I had a bunch of them. Here are a couple, though I did not get my hands on the most coveted, which was only available if you actually appeared on the show. I never made it to Teddington Lock, but I still remember that address from sending off for all those other badges. Oh, and I like Vimto, I guess, back before they ruined the recipe. At the risk of sounding very old, it used to taste a lot better back when I was a lass. I don't have a ton of gay buttons. It really wasn't safe to wear anything too obviously queer back in the 1970s and 80s, or at least nothing that could be read as queer from a distance. Here, I must confess that I have zero recollection of attending any lesbian conference or Pride in 1981, so these may have been buttons that someone gave me after the fact. And is my mum thinks I'm at the movie even queer? I'd say so. This was a time of gentle misdirection for most people who wanted to find queer community. Some people may have forgotten that the pink triangle was once the predominant symbol of political queerness, at least on the East Coast. There were always some activists who were uncomfortable with linking gayness with the Holocaust. The inverted pink triangle was indeed the symbol that Nazis forced gays to wear. And while it was important to remember that history, it was hard to find any queer joy in the pink triangle. In retrospect, Remember the Lavender Menace was perfect for this period. It's subtle, but it also nods to an important event in lesbian history. The 1969 protest against Now's refusal to engage with lesbian issues. I was a very keen young feminist, and the Corrie Bill, a piece of legislation that would limit access to abortion, was introduced during my years at university. I went down to London for a couple of marches, but of course, I also wore the badges. The other general political issues that were particularly salient at this time were around apartheid and nuclear power. If I hadn't left Britain when I did, I'm sure I'd have a whole bunch of Coal Not Dole buttons. I come from a family of miners, after all, but I was already in the States during the miners' strike. Speaking of America, the first US political campaign I witnessed firsthand was the 1979 race between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. I was in the first year of university, and as an American Studies major, I got to spend a summer in Wisconsin, where I picked up these buttons. I think we all know how that race turned out. Speaking of American campaign buttons, I wish I still had my buttons from the 1988 race, which was, of course, a matchup of Michael Dukakis versus George H.W. Bush. Dukakis's Greek heritage went all the way back to Lesbos, and I'm sure I had a button that said lesbians lick bush. But believe me, that's not something you want to Google. Trust me on that. Either way, there were definitely lick bush buttons, which also made a reappearance when George W. Bush ran for president. As you can see, I always had a lot of buttons, but there was only one that people on the streets ever complained about. That was this one, Don't Do It Die, which was an attempt to discourage Diana Spencer from marrying Chuck Windsor. That's another campaign that didn't work out for the best. I was glad to see these particular buttons to remind myself that I always knew that wearing buttons is not enough. But it is a cheaper way to share a political point of view than, say, renting a billboard. I want to end on a coda. I really thought that buttons were a thing from my distant past. But as I was looking around the office, I realized that while I don't wear them anymore, I still have a habit of accumulating buttons. Here are two that I got when I visited the fantastic Solid State Books in Washington, D.C. They have my book, A Place of Our Own, 6 Spaces That Shaped Queer Women's Culture, for sale. And here are a couple that I picked up in other spots just in the last year or so. Apparently, the habits of childhood are very hard to shake. All right, that's it for another video. Do you collect buttons? I'd love to hear of any that you remember from your youth or indeed from more recent history. Please share those thoughts and memories in the comments below. That's also a great place to ask any questions you may have about my book, A Place of Our Own, 6 Spaces That Shaped Queer Women's Culture. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.